Let me tell you about two events that unfolded within 6 hours of each other in the last 48 hours that together represent the most consequential escalatory sequence this conflict has produced since the first missile crossed an international border. What Israel just did to Iran and what the United States Navy did immediately afterward are not two separate stories. They are two chapters of the same story. And that story, read together with the analytical framework that only comes from decades inside military intelligence, tells you something about where this conflict is heading that should fundamentally change how every person watching this video thinks about the next 30 days in the Middle East. Let me be absolutely clear about who I am before we go any further. I served as a United States Marine Corps intelligence officer. I spent years as a United Nations weapons inspector on the ground in some of the most dangerous and strategically sensitive environments this planet has produced. I have sat in rooms where weapons systems like the ones that were just employed are analyzed, where targeting packages like the one Israel just executed are war-gamed, and where the second and third order consequences of exactly this kind of escalatory sequence are modeled in detail that would shock most people watching mainstream news coverage of this conflict. And I'm telling you right now, with the full weight of that experience, that what just happened is not an escalation. It is a threshold crossing. And threshold crossings are qualitatively different from escalations in ways that determine whether this conflict remains manageable or becomes something that no one currently involved has the tools to stop. Here is what Israel did. In the early hours of the morning, Israeli Air Force F-35 Ayadir aircraft, the Israeli variant of the F-35 with indigenous electronic warfare modifications that make it arguably the most capable combat aircraft in any regional air force, conducted a deep strike mission against Iranian territory. Not against Iranian proxy forces, not against Iranian-backed militia positions in Syria or Iraq or Lebanon, against Iranian territory itself. The targets were 3 facilities associated with Iran's ballistic missile production infrastructure, specifically the Shahid Hamad Industrial Group complex near Tehran, which is the primary production facility for Iran's liquid-fueled medium and long-range ballistic missiles. The Parchin military complex southeast of Tehran, which houses components of Iran's missile guidance and warhead development programs. And a third facility, near Isfahan, that American intelligence assessments have associated with solid fuel propellant production for Iran's newer generation of ballistic missile systems. Let me be very precise about what those 3 target selections tell you, because the targeting logic reveals the strategic objective more clearly than any official Israeli statement will. Israel did not strike Iranian air defense systems. Israel did not strike IRGC command facilities. Israel did not strike oil infrastructure or power generation. Israel struck the specific industrial nodes that produce the missiles that threaten Israeli territory. This was not punishment. This was not deterrence in the traditional sense of imposing costs to change behavior. This was an attempt at capability degradation. Israel was trying to reduce Iran's ability to produce the ballistic missiles that have been raining down on Israeli territory by destroying the production infrastructure at its source. That distinction between punishment and capability degradation is critical. Punishment strikes are designed to impose costs sufficient to change adversary behavior. They depend on the adversary making a rational calculation that the cost of continued aggression exceeds the benefit. Capability degradation strikes are designed to physically reduce adversary capacity to conduct the actions being objected to, regardless of adversary intent. They do not depend on rational calculation. They depend on physical destruction of the industrial base that makes the objectionable capability possible. Israel just conducted capability degradation strikes against Iran's missile production infrastructure, and the operational logic behind that choice tells you that Israeli leadership has concluded that deterrence, in the traditional sense of imposing costs to change behavior, has failed. Iran has demonstrated through months of ballistic missile strikes against Israeli territory that it is not deterred by the costs Israel has imposed through previous retaliatory operations, so Israel shifted to capability degradation. Destroy the factory and you reduce the missile supply regardless of Iranian intent. That is a sound operational concept. The question is whether the execution matched the concept. And the answer to that question is where the analysis gets genuinely complex. If you are watching this and beginning to understand that what Israel just did represents a fundamental shift in how this conflict is being fought, rather than another iteration of the tit-for-tat exchange pattern that has characterized it to this point, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I am about to explain is the operational effectiveness of the Israeli strikes and why the answer to that question matters enormously for the second half of this story, which is what the United States Navy did 6 hours later. Let me give you the technical assessment of the Israeli strike effectiveness, because this is where most media coverage will fail you completely. The F-35I aircraft that executed this mission carried a combination of Rampage supersonic air-to-surface missiles and Spice 2000 precision glide bombs. The Rampage is an Israeli-developed supersonic standoff missile with a range of approximately 150 kilometers and a 150-kilogram warhead optimized for hardened infrastructure. It flies at speeds exceeding Mach 2 in its terminal phase, which significantly reduces the interception window for air defense systems. The Spice 2000 is a GPS and electro-optical guided glide bomb with a 900-kilogram warhead and a standoff range of approximately 100 kilometers, providing precision sufficient to place warheads within 3 meters of their programmed impact points against large industrial facilities. The Shahid Hemet complex received multiple Rampage impacts against production buildings and missile assembly areas. The Parchin complex received Spice 2000 impacts against warhead development facilities and guidance component laboratories. The Isfahan facility received a mixed payload designed to destroy propellant storage and production equipment. Here is the honest assessment that most analysis will not give you. The physical damage inflicted on these facilities is real and significant. Production buildings were destroyed, assembly areas were damaged, equipment was lost, personnel were killed. But missile production infrastructure is not destroyed by destroying buildings. It is destroyed by destroying the specialized equipment, the precision manufacturing capabilities, and the technically trained workforce that operates inside those buildings. And specialized equipment can be dispersed, hardened, and hidden in ways that make a single strike package, however precise, insufficient to achieve complete capability elimination. Iran has spent decades operating under the assumption that its nuclear and missile production infrastructure would be targeted by Israeli and American strikes. It has dispersed those programs across multiple facilities. It has hardened critical components underground. It has maintained redundancy in production capacity specifically to survive the kind of strikes that Israel just conducted. The strikes will impose delay. They will impose cost. They will force Iran to expend resources on reconstruction and dispersal that could otherwise be used for production. But they will not eliminate Iranian ballistic missile production capability. They will degrade it temporarily, while Iran reconstitutes using the distributed backup capacity it maintains precisely for this scenario. Now let me shift to the second half of this story because 6 hours after Israeli aircraft struck Iranian missile production facilities, the United States Navy employed a weapons system that most people watching mainstream coverage of this conflict have not heard of, and that changes the strategic picture in ways that the Israeli strikes alone would not have produced. Share this video before I explain what the Navy just did because the two halves of this story, Israel's strikes and the American weapons system that followed, are inseparable in their strategic logic. And people need to understand both halves to understand what this 48-hour sequence actually means for the future of this conflict. Share it with everyone who is trying to make sense of what is happening in the Middle East right now. The United States Navy just employed the SM-6 dual-role missile in its anti-surface warfare configuration against Iranian fast attack craft operating in the northern Persian Gulf. Now, let me tell you why that specific weapons employment is strategically significant in a way that goes far beyond the immediate tactical effect of destroying a few Iranian fast attack boats. The SM-6, officially designated the RIM-174 Standard Extended Range Active Missile, is the most capable air defense missile in the United States Navy's surface fleet inventory. In its primary role, it is a long-range anti-aircraft missile capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 370 kilometers and at altitudes from sea level to the upper atmosphere. It costs approximately $4.3 million per round. It is the missile that American destroyers and cruisers depend on for defense against the most sophisticated airborne threats in the highest-end threat environments. But the SM-6 has a secondary capability that has been tested, validated, and integrated into American surface warfare doctrine over the past several years. In its anti-surface warfare configuration, with modified fusing and terminal guidance adjustments, the SM-6 can be employed against surface targets, against ships, against fast attack craft, against the kind of IRGC Navy vessels that have been harassing commercial shipping, threatening American naval assets, and conducting the maritime pressure campaign that Iran has been running against American interests in the Persian Gulf. What makes this employment strategically significant is not the immediate tactical result, however useful the destruction of Iranian fast attack craft may be. What makes it strategically significant is the signal it sends and the precedent it establishes. The United States Navy just demonstrated that it is willing to employ a $4.3 million air defense missile against targets that could have been engaged by far cheaper weapons systems if operational commanders judged that the tactical situation required it. That employment decision was not made by a destroyer captain managing a local threat. That employment decision was made at a command level that reflects deliberate strategic signaling. The signal is this: the United States is demonstrating its willingness to expend high-value air defense interceptors on Iranian fast attack craft in the immediate aftermath of Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. That timing is not coincidental. It is coordinated. It communicates to Tehran that American and Israeli operations are not independent responses to separate Iranian provocations. They are coordinated elements of a synchronized campaign that can employ American military capabilities against Iranian targets at any point in the threat spectrum, from fast attack craft to missile production facilities, when operational circumstances and strategic objectives require. Let me give you the full strategic picture, because the individual elements of this 48-hour sequence make partial sense, but the full picture requires understanding how they fit together. Israel struck Iranian missile production capability to degrade the industrial base that sustains Iran's long-range strike threat. The United States Navy struck Iranian fast attack craft using a high-value air defense interceptor to demonstrate American willingness to engage Iranian naval forces directly and to signal coordinated American-Israeli operational intent. And together, those two actions within 6 hours of each other tell Iran something that no diplomatic communication can convey as clearly. The combined American-Israeli response to Iranian military pressure is not constrained by the incremental, proportional, and carefully calibrated approach that characterized earlier phases of this conflict. That is a significant shift, and Iran's response to that shift will determine whether what we are watching is the beginning of a controlled campaign to degrade Iranian military capabilities or the opening sequence of an escalation spiral that neither side fully controls. Subscribe to this channel if you want analysis that explains not just what happened, but why the timing, the weapon selection, and the target sets tell you something about strategic intent that official statements are designed to obscure, because official statements are crafted to manage political reactions. What I am giving you is the operational reading of what the evidence actually reveals about strategic intent. And those two things are often very different. Let me address Iran's position right now, because understanding how Iranian leadership is processing what just happened is essential to understanding what comes next. Iran is absorbing the most direct strike on its mainland missile production infrastructure in the history of this conflict. Simultaneously, it is watching the United States Navy employ its highest capability surface combatant weapon system against Iranian naval assets in the Persian Gulf. And it is doing all of this while managing the domestic political consequences of having strikes on Iranian territory visible to the Iranian public in ways that cannot be concealed or minimized. Iran's leadership faces a constraint that is genuinely acute. Iranian strategic doctrine, Iranian revolutionary ideology, and Iranian domestic political requirements all demand a response that demonstrates continued capability and resolve. Absorbing Israeli strikes and American naval attacks without a response that imposes visible costs on the attacking parties is politically unsustainable in the Iranian domestic context. The regime's legitimacy depends in part on its narrative of resistance and capability, a narrative that becomes difficult to sustain when production facilities near Tehran are smoking ruins and American missiles are destroying Iranian fast attack craft in the Persian Gulf. But Iran's response options are constrained by exactly the capabilities that were just demonstrated. Iran has been firing ballistic missiles at Israeli territory throughout this conflict, and the political and strategic effect of those strikes, while real, has not changed the fundamental trajectory. More ballistic missile strikes against Israeli territory after Israel just struck Iran's missile production infrastructure are available as a response, but they do not change the strategic equation. They reinforce the justification for continued Israeli strikes against Iranian production facilities. Iran could escalate to strikes on American targets directly. There are American military personnel and facilities across the Middle East within range of Iranian ballistic missiles. American bases in Iraq, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait all represent potential targets for Iranian retaliation against American naval actions in the Persian Gulf. And striking American targets directly would impose costs and create political pressure on the American administration to restrain Israeli operations in ways that purely Iranian-Israeli exchanges do not. But striking American targets carries its own risks. The United States military response to direct Iranian strikes on American personnel would not be limited to the kind of measured, proportional response that has characterized American actions to this point. Strikes on American bases that kill American service members would produce an American military response calibrated to the level of American casualties and to the political pressure that American casualties generate. And that response could involve a level of American military commitment against Iranian targets that would be qualitatively different from anything Iran has faced to this point. Let me walk you through the military mathematics that explain why Iran's response options are constrained in ways that are not immediately apparent from the outside. Iran's ballistic missile production capability has just been degraded by the Israeli strikes. The degree of degradation is uncertain but measurable. Iran's fast attack craft capacity has just been reduced by the American naval strikes, and Iran's overall strategic position is now defined by a 48-hour sequence that demonstrated coordinated American-Israeli willingness to strike Iranian territory and Iranian naval forces without the careful escalation management that characterized earlier phases of this conflict. That combination, reduced production capacity plus reduced naval capacity plus demonstrated willingness of the opposing coalition to act coordinately and decisively, narrows Iran's response options in ways that Iranian strategic planners are working through right now with extraordinary urgency. Iran can respond in kind and accept an escalation cycle that puts Iranian territory at risk of further and potentially more comprehensive strikes. Iran can respond asymmetrically through proxy forces and accept the reputational cost of responding to direct strikes on Iranian territory through indirect means that signal limited capability and resolve. Or Iran can absorb these strikes and recalibrate its strategy around capabilities and approaches that the combined American-Israeli campaign has not yet degraded or targeted. None of those options is comfortable. All of them carry significant risks. And the choice Iran makes will be made by human beings operating under extraordinary pressure with incomplete information and with domestic political constituencies demanding outcomes that the strategic and military realities of Iran's current position make difficult or impossible to deliver. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because this 48-hour sequence is not a contained escalation. It is the opening of a new operational phase in this conflict, where American and Israeli military actions are visibly coordinated, where Iranian territory and Iranian military capacity are being directly targeted, and where the response dynamics that determine whether this conflict stabilizes or spirals are being established in real time by decisions that are being made right now in Jerusalem, in Washington, and in Tehran. Let me give you the geopolitical dimension, because what just happened in the Middle East in the last 48 hours is not only a Middle Eastern story. It is a global story with implications that every major power is processing and incorporating into its own strategic calculations. In Moscow, Russian military and political leadership is watching this escalatory sequence and drawing conclusions about the willingness of the United States to participate in coordinated military campaigns against adversaries that challenge the existing order. The demonstration that American naval forces will employ high-value weapons systems against Iranian targets in coordination with Israeli strikes on Iranian territory provides Russian planners with data about American escalatory willingness that they are incorporating into their own risk assessments. In Beijing, Chinese leadership is conducting a parallel analysis with specific attention to the coordination architecture between American and Israeli forces. China's own strategic planning for potential conflict scenarios involves adversary coalitions that would combine American military power with regional partners in ways analogous to what the American-Israeli combination just demonstrated. The operational details of how that combination was coordinated, what intelligence was shared, and how the timing of the two operations was synchronized are all inputs to Chinese planning that will affect Chinese strategic behavior in ways that extend far beyond the Middle East. And throughout the Arab world and among American allies globally, governments are watching this sequence and updating their assessments of American reliability, American escalatory willingness, and American strategic commitment to outcomes in the Middle East that prevent Iranian regional dominance. Those assessments will shape alliance behavior, basing agreements and political support for American policy in ways that have tangible military and strategic consequences. The 48-hour sequence that just unfolded is not only significant for what it did to Iranian missile production facilities and Iranian fast attack craft. It is significant for what it demonstrated about the nature and the depth of American-Israeli military coordination and about the willingness of both governments to accept escalation risks that previous phases of this conflict suggested neither was willing to accept. Let me bring this to where it belongs. Israel did the unthinkable. It struck Iranian territory directly, targeting the industrial infrastructure that sustains Iran's ballistic missile program. That act carries strategic implications that go beyond the immediate damage to three facilities. It establishes that Israeli red lines have shifted, that Israeli willingness to accept escalation risk has increased, and that Israeli strategic patience with the incremental approach to managing Iranian military power has run out. And then the United States Navy used an insane weapon, a $4.3 million air defense missile against fast attack boats that could have been engaged by far cheaper means. That employment decision was not tactical, it was strategic. It was a demonstration of American willingness to expend high-value assets against Iranian targets in the immediate aftermath of Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. It was a signal of coordination, and it was a message delivered in the language that military professionals understand most clearly, the language of operational action rather than diplomatic statement. Together, those two actions within 6 hours of each other represent a threshold crossing that changes the parameters of this conflict. Not because of the immediate physical damage, though that is real, but because of what they demonstrate about American and Israeli willingness to escalate, about the coordination architecture that links their military actions, and about the strategic calculation that has produced the judgment that direct strikes on Iranian territory and Iranian military assets are now acceptable costs for achieving the objective of degrading Iranian military capability. Iran is absorbing that judgment right now, and Iran's response, whatever form it takes, will determine whether this conflict enters a phase of managed degradation or a phase of uncontrolled escalation. The next 72 hours will tell you which way that judgment goes. Pay attention, because this is the moment where the trajectory of this conflict gets locked into a path that will define the Middle East for a generation. Share this video, because the full picture of what just happened, both halves of this story, the Israeli strikes and the American weapon, together in their strategic context, is not being given to you by sources that have to manage political relationships and official narratives. I do not have those constraints. What I have is 3 decades of experience inside the machinery of military intelligence and weapons inspection. And what that experience tells me is that what just happened in the last 48 hours is one of those moments where the people who understand what is actually occurring will look back and recognize it as the turning point that everyone else missed while it was happening. You are seeing it now. Make sure others do too.